All right, Alexander, let's do a Ukraine update. Missile strike, drone strike. The missile strikes are taking out air defense as well now, which is something they did last week, but they did it again this week. So it's kind of an evolution, I guess you could say, of the strategy. What else? Bakhmut, I'm hearing more incremental advances, but I'm also hearing that Ukraine is throwing more soldiers and reinforcements into that area. And I'm trying to think, is there anything else? I mean,
no, but I think what you've said is, I
think
think
the missile strikes were
are the big news, and I think that they are. I mean, and I think that this is the big story, as you correctly said, because first of all, they're getting bigger, and I mean, this is the contrast of what we're hearing about the Russians running out of missiles. The number of missiles that the Russians are now starting to launch in these missile strikes. I mean, it's not a vertical line upwards, but they're gradually increasing, and they're now starting, where they're still continuing to hit the energy infrastructure and doing devastating damage, but they're also, as you correctly said, now openly going after the air defense system. And I'm privileged to have been contacted by various military people and people with defense and industry backgrounds, and they've been giving a lot of very interesting information. And they've been saying that one of the things about the original missile strikes, the big ones against the energy system, is that the Russians now have a very good idea of where the air defense missiles are located, and they're now able to start hunting the air defense missile installations themselves. We've already had reports about how the Ukrainians are starting to run out of S-300 missiles. And the point is that once the Ukrainian air defense system finally breaks down, it will never completely disappear, but once Ukraine doesn't have coverage across Ukraine, once it's become fragmented and degraded, the Russians can launch their heavy bombers. And this was also talked about on the Financial Times. They can attack Ukrainian fortifications in Donbass. They can disrupt Ukrainian communications. They can do things with gravity bombs that they haven't been able to do up to now because the air defense system made it impossible. So that's what they're doing, and you can see that this is an evolving story. It's becoming more powerful with every single missile strike, and the Russians are launching more missile strikes, and they're launching more drone attacks, and they're apparently building more and more drones themselves. And building drones was something that Putin and Russian officials were talking about extensively at that military collegium meeting. So this is an evolving thing. And frankly, one Patriot missile battery isn't going to make a difference.
Yeah, and the Russians are obviously not running out of missiles, though the collective West media would like everybody to believe that they are. And the Zelensky regime would like everybody to believe that Russia's running out of missiles. It's just not true.
It's simply not true. And, there has to come a point when this story of Russia running out of missiles really people have to stop repeating it. I have been reading articles about this since March. I remember one which appeared in the Daily Telegraph in Britain in March, which said that the Russians are almost out of missiles. And it was a couple of days after the war started. And for one thing, they won't be able to make more missiles because all these missiles use Ukrainian engines, which simply wasn't true. But, this story of Russia running out of missiles is obviously wrong, and it needs to be stopped because it's creating a completely distorted hopes in Ukraine and elsewhere that this is all going to run out, when of course all the indications are on the contrary, that it's actually building up.
Right. So Stoltenberg, in an interview yesterday, he called for more weapons, NATO weapons, to be given to Ukraine because he said it may sound like a paradox. He said, that's a direct quote, it may sound like a paradox, but the more weapons we give Ukraine, the closer to peace. It's the shortest route to peace, he said. More weapons means more peace. But he also said that he considered Kiev's attacks on military facilities in Russia, inside of Russia, as perfectly legitimate. Every country has the right to defend itself. And on a similar note, the National Security and Defense Secretary, Danilov, said that the Ukrainian army can enter the territory of Russia and conduct military operations there if necessary.
Yeah, very interesting comments.
They have it on their on their minds to enter Russia. They really do. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's definitely there. It really is something that they're thinking about.
Absolutely. Let's just start with Stoltenberg, because actually I thought those were extremely defensive comments from Stoltenberg. Clearly, somebody has been saying in private, all this sending of weapons to Ukraine is prolonging the war. It's not ending it. And Stoltenberg, who is an extreme hardliner, as he's shown right the way throughout this conflict, is trying to push back and say, on the contrary, we're not prolonging the war, we're trying to end it by sending weapons. So clearly there's been some kind of a row in the background. One wonders who exactly has been bringing up these issues. A reasonable guess is one of the smaller NATO states, perhaps Hungary, perhaps France is one of the bigger ones, but Macron has been saying things. But it was interesting to see Stoltenberg on the defensive over this. And I wonder whether one of the reasons he's on the defensive is because of the news on the battlefields. Because, as you rightly said, there's been more information from Bakhmut. There was a fair amount of news this morning talking about more Russian incremental advances around Bakhmut. There's been lots of talk about Ukraine trying some kind of offensive in Donbass, that they were supposed to be attacking places in northern Donbass. They were supposed to be pushing back near Bakhmut. Doesn't seem as if that's gone terribly well. And on the contrary, it looks like the Russians are continuing to gain ground. And Ukraine is clearly losing large numbers of men here. They're still pouring more men into the meat grinder in Bakhmut. They don't seem to be prepared to stop. And I suspect there's a lot of behind the scenes anguish about this within the West, because they will all know about this, and there's arguments about it. There's complaints to Stoltenberg from some people, and they're saying, look, why are we persisting with this war? It's bleeding Ukraine to death. It's not doing our economies any good. Let's try and find a way out. And Stoltenberg is coming back and says, well, of course, we must keep providing the Ukrainians with every weapon that they want and keep on until victory. And if the Ukrainians attack deep into Russia, well, that's nothing to do with us. That's fine with us because, that's simply self-defense. So it seems to me that there's some kind of argument going on, and probably it's events on the battlefields that are driving it. Now, we did a program about Ukraine marching into Belgorod, and I think we said at the time in that program that it's something that we both think Ukraine will probably at some point do. When things get really desperate, it'll be their last big throw. March into Belgorod, hope this creates a big crisis in Moscow, brings down Putin, brings Russia to the negotiating table, gets the Russians to surrender, energizes, electrifies the whole world. It would actually be a desperate move. It would make no military sense. It would expose the Ukrainian forces advancing into Belgorod to disaster. But the Ukrainians are now talking about it. It's a further sign that the situation in Donbass, in Bakhmut, in those places is becoming increasingly desperate. That the fact that they're talking about this desperate throw shows that the situation is indeed becoming desperate. I think they will do it. I think at some point they will do it. I'm sure the Russians think that too.
Yeah, they only have two plays left, from what I understand. Okay, they can continue Bakhmut in that direction, and then they only have two other directions, and that one is Kherson, Melitopol, actually down to Melitopol, and then up to Belgorod.
Yeah.
But Melitopol, from what I understand, is off the table because they're moving everything from that area to Bakhmut. At least those are the reports that I'm
Yeah.
getting. I can't confirm
Absolutely.
that, but that's what all the reports are saying. That they're depleting their forces, but from the south. But you are getting reports that they are building up as much as they can those forces in the north.
Exactly. That's what I'm hearing, and I think that is exactly what they're doing. I mean, they're sending as many troops as they can to try and hold Bakhmut, because I think they understand that if they lose Bakhmut, the Donbass essentially is lost. It will take a few weeks or months to play out, but Bakhmut is clearly the key. So they're sending all their troops to Bakhmut. That's putting more of those troops closer to the positions where they might advance through the north in the northern areas into Russia's western regions, Belgorod and all the rest. And I think that is increasingly what they're going to do. I mean, I think the Melitopol offensive idea is gradually dying out because even Zaluzhny admitted he doesn't have enough troops to do it. And all the reports are that there's now lots of Russian troops in the area, very heavy Russian fortifications. It's simply not a practical plan.
Okay, so the other story that we could discuss, maybe to wrap it up, is the missile that landed in Belarus. The Belarus military saying this could be a provocation. Maybe it was just a missile that misfired, or a provocation. It kind of mimics the missile that landed in Poland to a certain extent. Kind of mimics that scenario. But there were no deaths in this missile landing, this S-300 that landed in Belarus. But what do you think?
Right.
Is another possibility to try and widen the war out by trying
Yes.
to create some trouble in Belarus? Maybe you hope that by getting Belarus involved in one way or another, you can maybe get Poland or the Baltics or NATO involved or something like that, or
Yes.
just another case of a missile misfiring.
Yes, well, let me first of all remind you that I changed my view about the Ukrainian missile that fell into Poland. I'd originally thought that was a mistake. That was just an accident. But then I heard Scott Ritter and others, by the way, analyze the whole thing properly, and they said it is impossible that it was a mere accident. And in fact, it looks as if it probably was some kind of an intended provocation. Now, if that was a provocation with the missile that hit Poland, then it seems to me most probably it was a provocation with the missile that landed in Belarus, or rather that was launched towards Belarus, and which Belarus's air defense system apparently shot down. And I can't help but think that it's exactly what you said, that the Ukrainians, they're seeing this build-up of Russian forces in Belarus. They're seeing the fact that Belarus and Russia are increasingly integrating, some say even merging their militaries. They're becoming very nervous about this. The Ukrainians are becoming very nervous about this. They're trying to start a conflict, so it seems to me, in Belarus area, trying to get the Russians and the Belarusians to act before they're ready, and at the same time dragging Ukraine's Western allies by expanding the war. Ukraine has repeatedly tried to expand the war. They were trying all kinds of things, if you remember, some months ago in Transnistria. That didn't work out. It looks to me as if this is another attempt to do the same with Belarus. And like the Belgorod venture, which Danilov is now clearly signaling it's going to come, it looks to me as if a further sign of Ukraine beginning to get desperate.
Okay. Any other stories that we need to cover?
Yeah,
This update, or?
it's complicated. It is the big thing, but the missile strikes were the Russian missile strikes are the big story because we're now beginning to understand the logic behind this campaign better. Go after the energy system, go after the railways. The Ukrainians have brought out 2 steam trains to keep their railway, try to keep, some kind of movement on their railways going. It's really terrible to see, actually. And going after the air defense system as well. But it's the battle, what's going on in Donbass, which is in some ways the underlying story. And this is very difficult to get all the details of. But my sense is that the last week, things have gone very badly for Ukraine. I read a report that the Russians are claiming that in one area, 20 Ukrainian officers were killed, commissioned officers, over a space of just a couple of days. Now, if you're losing people of that importance, then your losses must be very high indeed, because you don't want to lose your officers. So it looks as if things are really not going well for Ukraine in Donbass, and we're starting to see these more desperate moves. Obviously the steam trains, but the missile in Belarus, the talk now about striking at Belgorod. And it could be that what Ukraine is also doing is it's telling the West, look, we are desperate. If you don't help us in some way now, we will do something that will really be so desperate that it will be bad for you as well. It's a kind of, if you like, blackmail by the Ukrainian government, the Zelensky government, to its Western backers as well.
All right, we will leave it there. The Duran.locals.com. Look for us on Rockfin as well, and go to the Duran shop, 10% off. Use the code. Good day. Take care.